One, two, three. All right. Let's switch here. Make some adjustments. Hey everybody, good to see you all tonight. I will mute that. See who all is watching now. I see a few of you out there, so thanks so much for joining. About 6 are listed as watching, so I'm so thrilled that you've chosen to hang out with us tonight. We'll be going through a lot of the stickier stuff on Revelation, and we'll dive in here momentarily. I just want to get to the point where I can verify that things are working. And there's a little bit of delay for that. So if you'll pardon me for a moment. I unfortunately don't have an engineer on the other end to verify all that stuff. All right. We are up and running. Excellent. Well, it's good to see you all out for checking us out and take some time to spend with me as we go through this study on Revelation tonight. And I did a Facebook Live video about an hour ago, or actually about 45 minutes ago, because I realized I'd forgotten to do it. I planned to do it this afternoon, and I'd forgotten to. Basically, we are diving into some of the stickiest stuff on Revelation. Now, things like the beast, the dragon, the prostitute of Babylon, the number 666, all those sorts of things. Now, if you haven't noticed yet, this is probably not going to be the sensationalist sort of response. So if you're looking for that, this is not that type of class, because when we dive in and get past a lot of the things that make news headlines, what we find is some truth in the message of Revelation about how it was communicated to the church of the first century and how we really need to receive it today. So, in keeping here, we're not going to go verse by verse. We're going to look at how the first century church interpreted some of the more difficult aspects. That specifically is what we'll be talking about tonight. And we're examining the themes and the difficult questions. Hey, Bill, thanks for coming. Good to see you. All right, so tonight we deal with some of the more difficult stuff. Let's dive in. Now, over the last several weeks, we have I have taken a lot of time to recap because I think it is important to look and try to understand, okay, here's how things fit together. This is the message of Revelation as a whole. However, there's a lot to cover tonight. So if you want a recap, if you want all that, go back and look at one of the previous weeks. I'm not going to be doing a recap tonight because we've got a lot of ground to cover. Okay? I'm going to pray, and then we're going to dive in. God, thank you so much for spending time with us. Thank you for the fact that we know you're always there with us, that you promise to never leave us or forsake us. And God, sometimes that's really a promise I need to hold on to. God, I'm grateful that even though there are billions of people in the world, you know me personally. You know each person here who's watching this, whether it be live or whether it be later on. And God, I pray that you just help us to recognize what you want us to recognize, to learn what you want us to learn. And God, help us to see how these truths that were communicated to the past impact us even today. It's in Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen. Okay, so we are going to continue on tonight. As I said, Revelation 12 through 18. We're not going to be doing a verse-by-verse study. That just, it can bog you down in the weeds, and I know places that have done a year and a half on that sort of thing. But we are going to address a lot of the more difficult topics. In fact, many of the end time studies, and the study of the end times, that word is eschatology. And so if you're reading a book or you hear somebody talk about eschatology, they're talking about a study of the end times. Most end time studies are built around these chapters. There are some others that go to the book of Daniel, chapter 13, or there's some others that have random passages, but this is where a majority of those come from. But as I said, when we dive in and we look at how the first century church understood it and we look at some of the clues around it, it's not as sensational as a lot of them would like it to be. Uh, Tonight we're going to be talking about 666, the beast, the dragon, the great prostitute, everything like that. And to begin, I just want to ask the question. I want you to consider, do you remember Y2K? Now, I graduated, and I know some of you hate hearing this, but here's the reality. I graduated in 1999. And so my first semester at college was the last few months of 99, and I came home as everybody was prepared for Y2K, as the computers turned to where some people had not coded for the millennium, the year 2000, so the computers were going to think it was 1900 or something like that. And that's what a lot of people were freaking out about. And there were a lot of different responses to it. Now, even going into it, like my family, we got like, all right, we're going to get a few extra things of bread. We're going to get an extra gallon of milk. We figure anything that happens is probably going to be resolved pretty quickly because this is not snuck up on us. And there were others, however, and some you might know personally, that went way intense with this, building bunkers, saving food to last for decades, stuff like that. And that's the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people treat these chapters like that. They look at these chapters about how this end times discussion looks with the dragon, the beast, and some people it just kind of go, okay. Some people basically take this and they blow it up, and that's all they want to understand of Scripture. They're a little too interested in the end times, I would argue. And then a more appropriate response, honestly, is all right. Well, it's good to be aware of. And it's good to have some knowledge. It's good to be interested. If you were interested in that, that's fine. But let's not go overboard with this. Let's not make it something that it's not. So we're going to be looking at how the first century church understood this message and what it meant to them. All right, so we are going to begin by reading in Revelation. I would encourage you to go ahead and grab your Bible because these texts won't be on the screen in the same way that I don't have them on Sunday mornings. But I will be reading a lot of chapters tonight. And did I? Okay, this is actually supposed to be Revelation chapter 12. I got confused. I was like, wait a minute, that's not 13. Okay, my slide is wrong. It's Revelation chapter 12. I'm going to read verses 1 through 7. That's where I'm going to go, and then we'll come back and we'll follow along. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns on 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child at the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who, this is important, will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness, where to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. And war broke out in heaven, and Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and his angels fought back. Okay, I like how commentator Darrell Johnson specifically puts this, and he says for a lot of apocalyptic literature, he is talking about Revelation, but his discussion is a larger point about apocalyptic literature. And remember, apocalypse is the very first word of Revelation. The revelation is the Greek word apocalypsis. That's where that comes from. So when we speak about apocalyptic literature, or this unveiling, revealing sort of literature, he makes a case that we should understand it a lot like political cartoons that we see today. So, for example, if you grew up around the era of the Cold War, and even before the era of the Cold War, I did not grow up during this time, but this is an image that I recognize because of my understanding of history. What you have is Khrushchev and JFK, each arm wrestling while they each sit on an atomic weapon with a finger near the button that they're going to blow it up. Now let's imagine that you actually took time to just describe that. You know, the one from the west and the one The one from the west and the one from the east both took their places, and they interlocked their hands, fighting for supremacy, with the threat that if either got too close to losing, he would hit the button, which, I mean, you could craft that in such a way that, again, when you're in the context, you would go, oh, I know that this never literally happened. I know that these two did not literally sit down at a table and try to arm wrestle, though I think a lot of times at Camp David that would help out a lot of international negotiations if it just came down to an arm wrestling contest. But you know, if you grew up in this time as the Cold War tensions were beginning to rise, as the Cuban Missile Crisis, as these things, if you understand the context, you can recognize it and go, "Oh, I know what the author, I know what the illustrator in this case is trying to convey." That's a lot of how we need to read apocalyptic literature. Not in a literal sort of sense, but in looking at these details and seeing how symbolic they truly are. So when we read Revelation 13, the first thing we come across, and what? I'm sorry, hang on a second. I feel like I just lost. I just completely lost several things. That's for that one. Here we go. So we have a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and basically what we have here, we have this introduction of an enormous red dragon, and then we have this woman giving birth. Now this looks different, but this is a story that many of us are very familiar with. The story that we're actually reading here is the story of the birth of Jesus, but from a cosmic perspective. And the reason that we can know that is because we can read down in verse 5, and I pointed this out when we read it. She gave birth to a son, a male son, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. We find that there is this one who's referenced, who, again, when followers of Jesus would hear that, they would have gone, oh, I know who that is. And he is the one who the dragon tries to kill. Well, if you know the narratives of Jesus' birth, not just the wise men and the shepherds and stuff like that, but you know that Herod himself tried to kill Jesus. They ended up fleeing to Egypt for a couple of years. And we have all of this. This is the picture of the birth narratives, but from a cosmic perspective, from the perspective of heaven. This is what it looked like. If you could peel back the curtain between this world and the spiritual world, this is what you would have seen. So that way, that's what we have here. We have this demonstration of what is taking place. And as we get into this apocalyptic literature, or excuse me, these chapters, that's what I'm looking for, as we're getting into these chapters, the dragon is going to play a key role in this. Now, it's important to recognize, and again, a lot of people have interpreted a lot of different things, but we see when we understand the greater biblical story, the dragon himself is Satan. And we could get into, we've talked about some of these other numbers and symbols, things like crowns and horns symbolized authority, symbolized power, all that sort of stuff. So we see this isn't just this isn't like a literal sort of thing. I would even argue that the first century church was not waiting for a literal beast to, where is it? Another sign appeared, or sorry, dragon with seven horns. Okay, that they were not waiting for a literal dragon to crawl out of the sea or something like that. But instead, they recognized here is how the Apostle John is representing Satan himself. So we get to chapter 13, and I already talked about political cartoons, so we're going to go on from there. And we have the introduction of the first beast. I'm going to go down chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Yep, okay. So there we go. I'm caught up with my slides. The dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, 10 crowns on its horns, and each had a blasphemous name. Again, these are all representations of power, of authority, things like that. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but he had the feet of those like a bear, the mouth like that of the lion. That dragon gave the beast his power. Here's an important key. The beast is not powerful in his own right. He is a puppet of the dragon, a puppet of Satan. Gave his power, his throne, and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast who had asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it?" Okay, the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God, to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, language, and nation. Okay, so when we look at Revelation chapter 13, here is where we get into where it's not as sensational as a lot of people want to make it out to be. Because when you look at the details of Revelation 13, this very much indicates that the beast itself is the Roman government. The first beast is pretty clearly, when you look at the context, the Roman government. Here, let me go through some of the reasons why I say that. First of all, in verse 2, and this is just more of a detail regarding somebody's coming in. Detail regarding the text. The beast I saw resembled a leopard. Basically, this is very much a description from Daniel chapter 7. One of the things I've reiterated week in and week out, there are 404 verses in Revelation, and there are over 500 allusions to the Old Testament. If you want to understand the Revelation, understand your Old Testament. So a lot of that is an allusion to that in Daniel chapter 7, and we would look back and see, oh, this is what that beast was all about. In verse 3, we had this detail that said, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. One of the cruelest emperors of the entirety of, at least in John's lifetime, the one who was writing this, one of the cruelest emperors to Christians was Nero. Nero killed himself by giving himself a fatal wound to the head. And so this is, I'm going to go back and I should have put a picture of, here's some example of, okay, there we go. There we go. Some examples of what Nero did. He had Christians thrown in the gladiatorial arena and torn apart by wild animals just for the amusement of the crowd. There are accounts of Nero having Christians dipped or doused with oil and burned alive to light his dinner parties in his garden. There are a lot of tremendously gruesome activities that Nero did, and he had this suicide wound to the head. As I mentioned a moment ago, I should have put this picture in. I remember Mikhail Gorbachev, if I recall. He was the one who had a very large birthmark on his head. And if you said the one with the mark on his head, people would go, oh, it's Mikhail Gorbachev, who they're talking about. Again, the first century church would have gone, somebody who is mean to Christians, somebody who has a wound to the head. I know who that is. That's Nero. Verse 4, this was a common sort of statement regarding the Roman government. They say, who is like this? Who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? This was almost a chant or a mantra. Who can fight us? Who can wage war against us? This was a very common position and statement about the Roman government. All of these things were very obvious to the first century church. So we continue on, verses 5 and 6, and I'm going to talk about the imperial cult here more in a little bit, but verse 5 and 6, beast was given power to utter proud words and blasphemies, to exercise authority, open the mouth to blaspheme God. The imperial cult, and as I said, I'll unpack this more in a minute, the imperial cult, one of their fundamental beliefs was that Caesar is God. Caesar is a deity. This was a complete blaspheme of who God is. The sin of blasphemy is the sin of claiming to be God. This, if you look, particularly in Mark chapter 14, this was the sin that the Pharisees crucified Jesus for. They didn't crucify him because he was a social revolutionary. They crucified him because he claimed to be God. So the claim of being God, the claim of being deity, was given to this, was the responsibility, the activity, that's a better word to say, the activity of this first beast, and we see this very much in line with the imperial cult. Verse 7, given the authority to persecute Christians. This is for a time, and Christians were enduring this at the time. Um, I saw a lot of people, um, and I understand where people are asking about. I'm not a constitutional law expert. I see where people are asking questions. Saw a lot of people claiming that closing churches because of COVID concerns was persecution, and I just wanted to redirect their attention to persecution that Christians are enduring all around the world, and go, if this is persecution, this is really pathetic. This is really paltry compared to what people all across the world are dealing with. And I mentioned earlier what some of the Christians that John was writing to were dealing with. So this beast is given authority to persecute Christians, and the beast is really a puppet of the dragon. I mentioned that a moment ago. While the first century interpretation very much is the beast, is the Roman government, it's very easy to look and say, okay, well, we don't live in the Roman government anymore, so how do we interpret this? Did this just have meaning for them, or is there meaning for us? And really, it's any godless government. You can look at any, and there are all sorts of statements and scriptural principles about submitting to the governmental authorities, things like that, such as that. However, any sort of godless government, it's very easy to. Oh, did I lag? Okay, well, looks like I'm back regardless. So when we look, we could look at any sort of godless government, and they would very much fit the bill. Now, are they necessarily the beast of Revelation? No, but we're going to see that there is very much a contemporary application for that. So any sort of godless government fits that bill. The second beast shows up, and I saw the second beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf, and made the earth and the inhabitants worship the beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to an earth in full view. Deceived the inhabitants of the earth, and ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast, or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has the insight calculate the number of the beast. For the number of a man, that number is 666. Okay, a lot of for the beast and did to the beast and for the beast, and there's a lot going back and forth here. So we've got the first beast, which is basically a puppet of the dragon. That's what we see identified. That is acting on behalf of the dragon, and the second beast is acting as a puppet of the first beast. So we have kind of a stair step effect. And as we look at the details again, what we find is that this beast is the imperial cult of the day. As I said earlier, the imperial cult, one of their primary elements, what included worship of the emperor. Um, Worship of the emperor. I'll talk about Mark of the Beast in a second. This was, I have to go back. I think this began with Augustus or right after Augustus. I don't know. I'm fuzzy on my Greek emperors anymore. It's been a long time since I looked at Roman emperors, excuse me. And we find that they exercised a lot of authority because everybody who worshipped the emperor, well, they knew that they were on the emperor's side. And when you have a giant empire, you want to try to find some common thread. What the Romans found out is that when they had a giant empire, conquering was easy. I'm going to quote Hamilton: uh, "Winning is easy, leading is harder." Yeah, or I guess. that was dying is easy, living is harder. That was George Washington saying that. But anyway, that was King George actually says that. Do you know what happens next? Do you know how to lead this sort of giant empire that you had? And what they learned is that it was not a good idea to kill local culture, local religion, all sorts of local things. They learned that that was a bad idea. But they also wanted to make sure that you were on Rome's side and you weren't going to suddenly sprout up and say, oh, well, we're going to try to win our independence back, because then you have little fires that you're trying to put out all over the empire. So that was right in line along the time that emperor worship began to be developed. And they began to practice it throughout the Roman Empire. This all ties in because then we get to the idea of what is the mark of the beast. A common use of a mark in Roman society, and again, we see people talk about computers and microchips, and a lot of this has to do with fear tactics in the 80s and 90s, and maybe they existed before that, but this was what I grew up in, the 80s and 90s. And there was a lot of fear tactics, and oh, well, that means a fighter jet, and that means a microchip, and people had their own conclusions. The use of a mark was actually pretty common in Roman society. This was not a weird thing at all. The use of a mark existed because when you went to the marketplace, you, in order to buy or sell, would need to pay a tax in advance so that the marketplace could keep running and that they would make their money. That was how the Roman society operated. If you did not get this mark, you could not buy or sell. The way that this developed was that people began to get the mark by coming up, and all in the process of paying their tax, they would say, "A la Caesar," or "Caesar is God." So this serves as a problem for Christians because they didn't believe Caesar was God. They believed only Jesus was God. Now, if you grew up in a Roman or Greek pantheon, or you had a bunch of different gods, you kind of went, all right, well, Caesar is that one. I didn't know about him, but I've got 70 gods over here, so what's another one? If you were a Christian, that served as a very, very problematic statement to say Caesar is God in order to get this mark so that you could buy or sell. This was a common thing in Roman society. So we have the Christians who are faced with this difficult proposition of, do I feed my family because I don't have enough to raise, or maybe I'm a cobbler, I fix shoes, or maybe I'm a carpenter and I can't farm all day enough to raise my family. How do I go to the market and buy and sell if I won't say Caesar is God? And their decision of becoming a Christian became very much about their livelihood. It was not just a societal statement. It was not just a cultural, oh, hey, I'm here now, or this is what I check in my census when the Roman census takers comes around. No, this was a big deal because and we find a lot of early church, early Christians, excuse me, a lot of early Christians, a lot of early church fathers writing about this, about, do I, just say it so I can get what I need for my family, then repent later, or is that not a good thing to do and I never should have done that to begin with? So we have these Christians really struggling with, do I take this mark, this emblem or this symbol that represents that I can buy and sell in the marketplace? This was a very common thing. It was not sensationalized to the early church. And so what we find in Revelation 13 is that the Apostle John says, well, the mark of the beast, which is on their hands or their foreheads, that which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let that person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of man, that is 666. Okay. I want to back up because there are some very specific contextual details that help us understand this. Verse 17, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, to buy or sell, common thing, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. What does that mean? This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. I don't think I probably have to tell you that a lot of people have made 666 mean everything under the sun. I mentioned Mikhail Gorbachev earlier. I very vividly remember in a church setting somebody identifying that birthmark on his head as being the mark of the beast. I have heard every single president that has existed in my lifetime has been associated with the beast, the mark of the beast in Revelation. I remember hearing a coast to coast radio talk show, and talk radio is just a plethora of crazy insights can come from that. But I remember somebody coming out and saying the U.S. Postal Service, because the little barcodes on the envelopes were in the middle, the first two, or the first two numbers were six, and the middle two numbers were six, and the last two numbers were six. And people have even become incredibly superstitious about this. I used to work when I was in college. I had a job, and my work study was at the IT department, which was also the telephone office for the church. When we were changing some stuff around, and we had a technician come in, and the number for testing we set up, because everything on campus began with a 3, so everything began with a 3. But the number we set up for testing was 3666. And I just went, that's kind of curious that you would pick that. He said, nobody ever wants that number. It's the number people run away from. I have seen evidence of people who, when their car reaches a close place where it says 666 across there, they will get out and make somebody else drive it because they're so terrified. There's so much superstition around this. But again, if we look at the context and we look at what it meant to the first century church, we don't need to be afraid of it. We don't need to be fearful that we're going to be led astray by this sort of thing. So when we look here, it's possibly, and this is quite a possibility, what's called gematria. And the reason that we would say that is, first of all, this sort of thing, and I'll explain what gematria is in a moment. First of all, gematria was not uncommon in Hebrew and Aramaic writings. Again, a lot of John's early readers would have had at least a Jewish upbringing, would have had familiarity with Hebrew and Aramaic. Gematria, also, if you look, there were some allusions even in our text to math, of all things. Maybe that's it. Maybe math is the beast. Math is the mark of the beast. I figured it out. It's algebra. Done. Okay. I should have never had to take those classes. Okay. So let's look here. So verse 17 again. So that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. Okay, number of its name. There's clue number 1. Let the person, verse 18, let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast. So we have this calculation idea, and that's what leads us to the idea of maybe it's gematria. What is gematria? Let me describe that. Gematria is the practice of assigning values to letters or numbers to letters. So, for example, if you took the English language and you did this, it wouldn't necessarily be 1 to 26. That's how I would think about it. But the way that this gematria of the day worked, it was a little different. Basically, the first 10, you would go 1 through 10, and then you would start going up by 10s. And then you would, once you got to 100, you would start going up by 100s. So you see A1, B2, C3, U 300, V 400, W 500. That is how, if we took how gematria worked in the first century, particularly in the traditions that John would have been writing to, this was how gematria worked, or assigning numbers to letters. So if it were me, and if I was numbering my name and I said, let somebody calculate the number of my name, you would take the letters of my name. So Mark would be 40, A would be 1, R would be 90, K would be 20, and these are associated with the slide that I just showed you. And then Messmore, you would put all these together and you would say that the number of my name is 591. 591 is the number of my name. So we have this, that makes sense. Okay, got it. Hopefully you're tracking because again, you can see me, I can't see you, and if I change over, I'm getting issues. So I will find out if there are questions in the chat later when I get to that portion. So if I numbered my name, it would be 591. So let's look over here. Revelation 13. What does 666 mean, people? Everything. In Aramaic and Hebrew, if you take Nero Caesar, how Caesar would have been referred to, how the most cruel Caesar or emperor to the Christians would have been referred to, and you were to take those letters, change them over to numbers via gematria, like we talked about, and added them up, they would be the number 666. Again, it's not sensational. I'm not going to sell books and sell videos scaring people and talking about this. But this is what we see. It's very possibly gematria. Now, there is a struggle or a challenge, if you will, with gematria. The challenge with gematria is that we have the number and we're trying to work backwards to the name. Now, those who would have known Nero Caesar, Caesar Nero, Nero Caesar, they would have Greek. It's funny because there's not a word order. You don't need a lesson in Greek tonight. But the challenge is we're working backwards. And so this is a very strong possibility. I would say this has a incredibly high probability of being what 666 really is all about. But the challenge is we're working backwards, and when you're working backwards, you can make a lot of different numbers come together to add up to 666. So for example, if I broke it down like this, 105, 550, 501. Okay, now let's do that. Now let's take it to the next step. What are those letters? Well, if we change them to Roman numerals and change those letters to Roman numerals, I'm sure you all remember your Roman numerals. X is 1000, right? X is 1000. No, X is 10, M is 1000. X is 10, M is 1000, I is 1, all that sort of stuff. So if you change them to Roman numerals, you have C, V, V, L, D, I, V. I should put that in uppercase because that would make a lot more sense. But that's what you would have in Roman numerals. Now, V would be a U in our alphabet, so let's change it to, I messed up again. Holy cow, I am just not on it. So C-U-U-T-D-I-U is what that should be. Now we add in some sensical letters. So we would have a cute purple dinosaur. So therefore the conclusion is 666 equals Barney. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have unveiled it to you. Barney is the mark of the beast. So you see, you can work this backwards and you can make it mean just about whatever you want it to mean if it is in fact gematria. However, when you look at the context, when you look at something that was very common to the first century audience who would have heard this, who would have understood it, and how they were speaking about him at the time, it would make sense that Nero Caesar is actually the name of the beast, and that is the number of his name. So the other major, or I wouldn't say major, I would say probable solution, because there's so many different interpretations of it, but this one would fit the let's look at it from the first century context perspective. We see in verse 18 that it is the number of a man. If you look at the Greek, it could be a number of a man, it could be number of man. There's a little question there about which way to translate that, but you see it's the number of a man. Basically, when we've looked and we've talked about numbers in the first week, the number seven is the number of completion or perfection. That is often thought of as the number of God. We see that there are sevens all throughout Scripture talking about completion and perfection. So the number 6, man, it'll never match up. It'll never get there. It's not the number 7. It's not the completion. It's not the perfection of God. It's 6. Dr. Randy Harris presented that to a crowd I was in one time, and I thought, There might be something to that. So, okay. So there are a lot of other things in chapters 14, 15, and 16, but a lot of those are really continuations of stuff that we've talked about previous weeks. So we're going to jump to chapter 17 tonight. And how are we doing? We are doing pretty good. Okay. Whoops. I have a message there. All right. We are at 6:45. We're churning on. We're shuffling through. So, verses 1 through 6 of chapter 17, we continue on. Here's what we see. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came to me. Come, and I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. The great prostitute was introduced. She is in cahoots, we'll say, with beast number one, beast number two, and the dragon who sits by many waters. With her, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Then the angel carried me away to the Spirit into a wilderness, where I saw the woman sitting on a scarlet beast, who was covered with blasphemous names, who had 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, and was glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand that filled with abominable things. Abominable, it's a fun word. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore the testimony of Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and the beast she rides, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast which you saw was now it what once was, now is not. It has come out of the best, kind of destruction." Okay, I'm going to continue on. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Uh, what we find, and again, this is fitting with the rest of Revelation when we look at this message to a church that was dealing with a tremendous amount of persecution. The things that consistently the Apostle John comes back to, and we see this in the 7 letters, and we see it so on. Furthermore, are the themes of perseverance in trial and not becoming complacent with your faith. And so what we find is that this prostitute really represents a type of pleasure-seeking culture that exists in the world. If you were to go back and look at the book of Ecclesiastes, the King Solomon says, I tried all of this. I gave myself everything my eyes desired. I tried many great works. Uh, I tried many women. I tried many things. I tried great wealth. I tried all of these things, and none of it ever brought fulfillment to my life. That is the allure that many Christ followers have. It's the allure that I've dealt with at times, is the desire to compromise, to go to the culture, to seek after some of these other things instead of living the type of life that God wants us to live. And so when we find that, um, yeah, so when we put these things together, the major characters, we see the dragon is Satan. We see the first beast that he controls is this godless government. That this may be one of the ways this may be one of the ways that Satan tries to attack the people of God. Here's something that I missed. I didn't bring up because I deleted my slides apparently in chapter 12. Is if you go back to chapter 12, I'm going to go to verse 13. That's where I'm going. Verse 13 of chapter 12 says, "When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for times and half a time out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman, sweep her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river, and the dragon had spewed out of its mouth. The dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring." And in case we were uncertain, back in chapter 12, that is a picture of the nativity scene and that the dragon is Satan, in verse 17, the Apostle John clarifies when the dragon was enraged at the woman, he went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring. Who are those? Who are those people? Those who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus. In many action films, if you watch 24 with Jack Bauer, if you watch Rambo, there's so many of these action films. One of the cliches or one of the common tropes is that the bad guy can't hurt the good guy, so he goes after a family member. He goes after a close friend. He goes after somebody the good guy loves. And that's really what we see taking place in Revelation. The major characters, the dragon, Satan, was defeated. He realizes he can't win. And so what he does is he raises up this sort of godless government to try to persecute the Christians and try to obliterate them in that way. And then the second beast tries to lure them astray by the imperial cult, tries to lure them to do something other than following Jesus with their life. And then finally, what the dragon attempts is by using, oh, it's false religions belief, excuse me. So if you were looking for a common application for today, we could look at false religions, false beliefs, that sort of thing. And then the dragon tries his third approach by using a pleasure seeking culture represented by the prostitute, trying to lure us by the lusts of our flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, things like that, tries to draw us away from the righteous life that God desires to seek whatever our flesh desires. And so the dragon, Satan, goes off to make war against mankind. Well, what are his attacks? He uh, tries to persecute through things like government, tries to I'm having trouble with words tonight. Words are hard. He tries to confuse or redirect through things like false beliefs and religions, or he tries to get you to compromise through a pleasure-seeking culture. And those are the major characters that we see in these chapters. Now, again, there's plenty of other things. There's much about the Battle of Armageddon, but really it's not a battle. Satan and his army show up, and then the next verse is they're defeated. So the armies of the earth go to make war against God, and then it's over. It's not a battle, it's a buzzard's buffet. So the big question, the application, is that we need to look at is, do we see our lives as a playground or a battleground? Do we recognize that the cosmic battle that waged war back when Jesus was born, and back since Satan was trying to defeat Christ in so many different ways, and now he goes off to make war because he's lost that battle. He goes off to make war against so many who have become followers of Jesus and hold to his name. Our lives are in reality a battleground. This is not just a you only live once, do what you want, do what feels good sort of thing, but this in reality is a battleground where we're going up against the enemy every single day. And to go back to Ephesians chapter 5, our fight is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities and principalities of the air. And that is what we have. Now, I'm going to now switch over from my all right. So far, I don't see a lot of questions, or I don't really see any questions right now, but I'm going to wait for just a second. And again, I want to thank you guys for hanging out with us tonight. And I hope that you learned something along the way. And I hope that this, because it looks like it's lagging out right now, which is awesome. I'll tell you what, shared internet is not good for these situations where you're trying to teach. It is a struggle. It is the struggle bus. So I don't know. Let me go back to my casting software, OBS. Looks like I have a good connection here. So somewhere in the grand scheme, what? I don't know if mine. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna put in here. So I just said if any questions were asked, I missed them because I had to refresh. So I'm waiting to see if there are any questions. As a reminder, this week we are getting back together with a lot of precautions. One of the things that we're not crazy about, but we recognized is necessary, is when we said, all right, if you're coming, you really need to reserve your spot because we have a reduced capacity. Given the orders from Frankfurt, we have a reduced capacity, and so we can't just have as many people as we normally do. So we need people to step up and identify if they're going to be with us tonight. Okay. Well, thus far, I've not seen any questions, so I want to thank you guys very much for hanging out. Again, I hope it wasn't too laggy or too crazy. And yeah, until then, I will catch you guys later.